I am pleased to introduce the following half-hour documentary film, Treasures, sponsored by the Ministry of Community and Cultural Affairs. This film is one of a series of documentaries in which we will take a look at the past, as seen through the eyes of some of Bermuda's senior citizens. We think that you will find their stories both entertaining and revealing, as they relive Bermuda's past and compare it with the present.
We visited Mr. Arnold Francis at his home on Napton Hill, where he recounted his life's achievements as a student, teacher, politician, and lawyer.
Yes, my mother arrived in Bermuda at about the age of 14 from St. Kitts. Her parents had emigrated to Bermuda about the turn of the century, and they left her as a young girl to complete her schooling. When she was finished, I suppose elementary school it was, she came to Bermuda to join her parents, and she was then, as I said, about 14 years of age. My father had an elder sister who had, with her husband, emigrated to Bermuda. Again, I'm not sure what year. And he had emigrated to the United States. He was living in New York and came down to visit his sister and her husband, and on that occasion met my mother, a young lady, I suppose about 18. The story is that he fell madly in love with her and proposed to her. I'm not too sure how old she was, and she was receptive, and he was suggesting to her that they should marry, and that he would, with her, return to New York. Well, in the 1718 or whenever it was, to a young lady like my mother, New York was a terrible place. People had guns and all that sort of thing. And she, I understand, said to him, well, if I'm to marry you, you're going to have to live in Bermuda. I will not go to that place called New York to live. My father, I think quite sensibly, when I look at the situation, decided that he was going to marry her at all costs, and so he left New York and came to Bermuda, married my mother, and they have lived here ever since. And so I and the rest of my siblings were born in Bermuda rather than New York. Thank goodness. It was in 1922 that I was born in a little clapboard two-story house in what they then called Smith's Hill off Kerman Avenue, where we lived. There were 3 elder siblings, 2 sisters and a brother, and we lived there until I was about 7 or 8 years old, and my father built his own home on what is known as Deepdale.
Mr. Francis took us for a tour of his childhood neighborhood.
That is where I saw the light of day for the first time, 73 years ago. And my father built his own home further on, where we're going to see now.
The area had changed dramatically over the years.
Yeah, so this is where I spent my young days, right on this house here. Okay? And it was, they've made some changes. For example, the steps were out in here. They've made some obviously sensible changes. So you come out on the side of the veranda. And other changes. One of the windows here, I was learning carpentry as a youngster, and I made a screen for it. That was my greatest achievement as a carpenter apprentice. So all of this property, every house you see from here up to Happy Valley Road, which is at the top here, all this was this man Hollis's property, and all this was dairy land where he kept his cows and grew vegetables and so on. And then they subdivided it. It was a big subdivision. My parents bought a lot here, but built this house, and similarly other people did. Right on the corner there, that was an A1 grocery branch, and that was the first job I had, delivering groceries in the area for the manager of the shop. I must have been about 12, 13, and I was working there. I worked there summers, no, a summer and Saturdays, you know. So it was, I can't remember what I got. I may have got 5 shillings a week or something. Well, I've actually stood behind this counter and served some customers for the, you know, for my manager, whoever was managing at the time. And if I weren't out delivering some things around the area and so on. So it, these are very old memories.
Very much so.
Old memories, very old memories. The first school I attended was a kindergarten school in the Happy Valley Smith Hill area called Winnie Seaton's Kindergarten. It was a school that many of us in that area attended as a kindergarten. Winnie Seaton was the person who first taught me, and I recall now sitting at a long table with slate and whatever one used on slates those days, chalk or something of that sort, learning the rudiments of the alphabet and numbers and so on. And then I think it was about at the age of 8 or 7 or 8, one moved on to what we then called the middle school. That was my Aunt Liz's school. One of the things I recall at Aunt Liz's school is learning how to spell the fruit banana. And we used to recite these. V-A-N-A-N-A, and we go running and tripping about saying V-A-N-A-N-A. That's one of the things that stuck with me. Well, of course, the next stage in my education was moving to what we then called the big school, which was Central School. I have some memories of Central, great memories. First of all, I started my career in cricket and soccer at Central. We always thought Central had the best of everything. It was the largest elementary school, and we used to worst the other elementary schools in these games. At the age of 13 plus, I was awarded what they would call the Packwood Scholarship, named and after Dr. Packwood. I think Dr. Packwood is the same person after whom Packwood's Old Folks Home, Packwood's Rest Home in the Somerset is named. And a contemporary of mine, Elise Allen, and I were the Packwood Scholars for 1935, I think it was. And from there we went on to Berkeley Institute. As it turned out, to make the story somewhat short, I became very good in the languages and had no difficulty in my Latin and French. In fact, in the junior Cambridge exams I used to have, I got a distinction in the French, credit in Latin, and also got my credits in the senior Cambridge examination. So that was Berkeley. In all the schools I attended, particularly from Central on, I stood out in sports, and so I became the house captain at Berkeley and the school captain at cricket and soccer. I went down, by the way, in literature simply because I was having such a great time running about, playing sports and so on, that I never read the set books we had for the exams, and in retrospect, understandably, of course, I went down. I had to take the exam on the second time, that is 1941. And that is where my friend and benefactor Victor Outerbridge, about whom I cannot speak too much, by sheer determination, because of course I was, as a young fellow in Bermuda those days, rather interested in having fun, chasing the girls and all that sort of thing. So, but he was behind me, this little Victor Outerbridge, behind me like a little terror, to insist that I stayed at it and took the exam again. So I did, and got through it. Victor Outerbridge became a great counselor of mine after that, and I, having got through the exams, he then, and those were the days where very few young men were going into teaching. Indeed, the situation perhaps has repeated itself today. And he, I could hear his voice now, "Young man, you're going to apply for the scholarship to go to Teachers College." Well, I got the scholarship. Tell my friends, the fellows, I said, "Oh man, I'm going down to the tropics, all the beautiful moonlight and the palm trees." I had to be sort of managed to, because they were saying, "Well, you're going off to be a teacher," and I tried to let them think that I'm still doing something. And look, it's not the teaching. I mean, I'm going down to the tropics and have a great time, the sort of thing. I had this very close, and still have in her spirit, close relationship with my mother. My father too, but my mother particularly. And of course she was in tears when I was leaving Bermuda for the first time at age 19, I think it was 18, 19. And so was I, in tears to leave my dear mother and home and friends and so on. And as it happened, the flight didn't take off that night, that evening, for that night from Baltimore, and so I had to go back home and repeat the thing the next evening. Because you went out at night. You took a tender from the what they used to call the yacht club steps at the bottom of Burnaby Hill, and you went out to Darrell's Island and took a plane, old lumbering seaplane, to Baltimore. Those of us who were on that flight to Baltimore.
Mr. Francis recalled the hazards of early air travel as he flew out of Bermuda for the first time.
Bermuda and Baltimore. Flying in the atmosphere, bumping. You got in more, what they call them, air pockets than ever. And if you were, the plane went in an air pocket and went down, it was like the elevator in a building going down without stopping in a tremendous speed. I recall being in the bathroom and that flight, the plane was in an air pocket. On one occasion, I got on my hands and knees and crawled back to my seat. So that was my first experience outside of Bermuda, traveling. I got to Jamaica, joined the college, went into class and began again, a most interesting 3 years in Jamaica. So my sports activities continued in Jamaica. I was able to get through my academic work, and because of the all-round activities I was engaged in the college, I was awarded a coveted prize called the Duff Memorial Prize there, which is awarded to the most outstanding all-round student of the college. All-round is the emphasis. And I believe I was one of the first non-Jamaicans to have been awarded that memorial prize.
Mr. Francis was made aware that career opportunities for black people were unlimited compared to Bermuda, as many positions of authority, like doctors, lawyers, and clergymen, were held by black Jamaicans.
And certainly that was an eye-opener to me. The danger or the unfortunate thing about Bermuda of that period was that it rather gave limited expectations to young black people at that time. Unless you stood over and had the tendency to look over the fence, so to speak, you could have very limited horizons. And so when I came back to Bermuda at the end of 45 and to begin my teaching career in 46, I had already absorbed all of those activities that I experienced in Jamaica. And one of the things I absorbed and I knew was that I came back knowing I wanted to do law. I wanted to become a barrister after the great
Mr. Francis completed his 3-year teaching contract at Central School, then set off to London to pursue his real interest, law.
I betook myself to New York, where I joined a friend, Walter Robinson, who was later to become a law partner of mine. He had just got married, and he and his wife were honeymooning in New York, and we all sailed to England on the Queen Mary. Again, I got involved in sport, cricket. I didn't play soccer. It was too cool for me to don shorts in England, so I played cricket there, in addition to studies, of course. I finished in I have to count these days now, 52. I finished my studies in 52, both degree and bar exams, and came back to Bermuda in August, I think August, September 52. Anyway, my friend Robinson, Walter Robinson, returned about a month later. We had already decided that we would set up a partnership in practice, so we opened our law firm in September of 1952 called Francis and Robinson, Barristers at Law, and we started practicing then. I developed pretty quickly a litigation practice. Eventually I had the largest criminal litigation practice on the island. And so our office was a 2-story building. On the ground floor was a little place called Stowe's Feed place, and above was our chambers, Francis and Robinson. Well, you could look out the window and look over the jail, and as I used to be teased by some people saying, you can see your lost cases, your clients who are in prison. But I recall one early evening I was working just after 5:30. Things have changed considerably, of course, all over the world in Bermuda. Quiet early evening I was working, and I heard this voice outside shouting, "Home, sweet home." And it happened to be the voice of a well-known character of that period, for Weatherbird. As a matter of fact, his picture adorns several places around here. And he was shouting out, and some of the prisoners behind the wall were shouting back to him, and he was saying, "Home, sweet home." It's Roy Sully. I think it was Roy Sully. One forgets these names.
As well as running a successful law firm, Mr. Francis also made his mark in the world of politics.
It wasn't until 1915 in a general election that I was elected as one of the representatives for Pembroke Parish, and spent the next 10 years in the House of Assembly. I was in those days with before parties. We had individual elections. Walter Rumson, who was my law partner, he had got in before, so we were both in the House of Assembly. Anyway, a group was putting together what became known as the Progressive Labour Party. I got involved in that. We put that together. I became the public relations officer during the campaigning and the party organizational period. I was doing a lot of speaking up and down the country. We got in the House. I was elected leader of the group, so I became the first political leader of the Progressive Labour Party as we sat in the House. Unfortunately, there was a rift, and that's another long story, which we don't
Not
have
considered a radical enough leader for the PLP, Mr. Francis left the party in 1965. He traveled to England in the same year with a delegation sent to talk to the British government about a new constitution for Bermuda, allowing a responsible government to be formed. Upon their return, a new party, the Bermuda Democratic Party, was forming, and Mr. Francis was invited to be the party's first leader. The new party never got off the ground, and Mr. Francis' political career lay dormant until the early 70s, when Sir Edward Richards was elected leader of the UBP and the first Premier of Bermuda. Mr. Francis then threw his hat in with the UBP, the party he hoped would bring Bermuda into the 20th century. In addition to his involvement in politics and his career as a lawyer, Mr. Francis was made the first chairman of the Bermuda Provident Bank in 1969, from which he retired 20 years later in 1989.
The chairman of that committee was Sir Henry Tucker. We met. I believe I was the first Bermudian practitioner to be appointed a Queen's Counsel. I say I believe because I believe there was another lawyer who perhaps was not practicing in Bermuda, Bermudian, who became QC. I said early on, I don't go into courts anymore, except on very rare occasions and often on the private matters in the judges' chambers. But my work is almost entirely drafting documents and opinions and advising, and I enjoy doing that.
Mr. Francis reflects on his life and how much things have changed in Bermuda.
Well, when I was young, of course, Bermuda was, as indeed the rest of the world has changed. Bermuda was, as the poet says, oh, so different from this. Brought up as a young, young black family. It was largely a segregated community, so you had your being in these areas and where you and your ilk you played. I came into Hamilton to attend Sunday school and church. I was a member of St. Paul's AME Church. My father was of the Wesley Methodist Church. Incidentally, his first names were John Wesley, his father having been a Methodist preacher in St. Kitts. So it was vastly different from this. One had very little occasion to, I suppose, go further into Hamilton than Court Street or Victoria Street in the business days. And so we grew up as in communities. Of course, it was before the motor age. And so if you were traveling, if you were going to Somerset or St. George's, you traveled by horse and carriage. You hired a carriage. I have great memories of going to cup match in a carriage hired by my parents as a youngster, driving to Somerset and by horse and carriage, and we would spend the weekend there during the cup match, staying at friends. In fact, one family we stayed with, they were my godparents. If you were traveling alone, you would go on cycles. So many a day I was cycling off to play cricket with a bat tied on the handle or somewhere if you were going to in my teenage, we were going to a formal dance, you would dress up formally, get on the bike and put your lady on the crossbar, and you would cycle off to the dance. I recall taking one young lady I was escorting to the dance, and her long skirt got hitched in the bicycle chain. So it was a little embarrassment, but we persevered. Didn't want to miss the dance. It was a quiet, peaceful country. Tourists traveled in carriages, and we young kids sometimes ran behind them and they'd throw out pennies to us.
Mr. Francis still enjoys an active life.
Yes, by way of recreation now, it's almost entirely going to the theatre and small parties. We have been great supporters of the festival. Very early in the day, my wife would bring the list to me, and we would pick out those things I want to see, and we would get the tickets, and we would go either just the two of us or with friends in a party. I'm not playing golf anymore, so my physical exercise is mainly walking. I walk mostly weekends, not every weekend, but mostly weekends. And that seemed to keep me reasonably fit. Reflecting on my life, I don't know whether there's anything I would change. I've had a full and varied life. I've enjoyed the various phases of my life as a pupil, student, teacher, lawyer. And in some ways, I feel quite lucky that I've been enabled to have such a rich life. So that I don't think there's anything that I would change significantly. I mentioned earlier that I have been fortunate to have a very good supporting parents, so that I'm quite satisfied that I've made my contribution to my country in the various things that I've done. I have a very happy married life. My wife, Anne, is supportive, and she helps to make my life fulfilling. She does a lot of things, particularly in traveling and entertaining my friends. She's a great entertainer, does it with a flair, and that makes life pleasant. The children are coming along. As I indicated earlier, my eldest daughter of my first marriage is a barrister who practices with me. My stepdaughter holds a responsible position with Marina Drug Company. And our youngest daughter, baby, she's a reporter at the Royal Gazette, a staff reporter, has her bylines in the newspapers. In fact, there's a story on one of the court cases with her byline today, Libby Francis. And our son, as I said, having finished university in the United States, he got his bachelor's degree, is now off studying law in England. So all in all, I think we have been fortunate as a family. I've been fortunate as an individual. And for a person born and virtually brought up in Bermuda, a little island, I've had a wide experience.